All right, I'll just start again by saying good evening. Thank you all for joining us. Happy fall. It has turned fall since the last time we were all together. This is our second conversation around the book Braiding Sweetgrass. And just to put it out there, just up front, our next two sessions will be in November 10th and December 8th. So you can pencil us in and go ahead and go online to Eventbrite and register. Again, I just want to say Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And again, her book's been on the New York Times, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for, I think it was, 63 weeks? It's amazingly long.
I think it's even more.
Is it even more now? Okay, yeah. Period of time. Tonight, as has been our, in the past, Elizabeth Howard is joining us, writer in residence. We thank her so much for being a part of this and continuing this tradition. And then this month we have a special guest, Paul Gunther, and I'm going to introduce him, but I also want to let you all know that our recording from last month is on our website, and I actually put the link down in the chat. So if anyone missed that or would like to see it again, it is there, and we will be doing the same again today. So let me just introduce Paul, and then I will turn it over to Elizabeth and Paul together. Paul Gunther is a veteran of the New York arts and design world, joining the Gracie Mansion Conservancy after 35 years as an author, consultant, and executive in the field of historical preservation, land use, and cultural institutions. He has worked as a consultant on a number of local arts and historical organizations, and has written for professional publications on topics ranging from architecture, landscape design, and preservation. Paul served as president of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, a New York City-based national education and presenting organization dedicated to the classical tradition. He formerly served as vice president of the Institutional Advancement and director of development at the New York Historical Society, the director of development and American liaison at the American Center in Paris, and the director of development and public affairs at the Municipal Art Society, and as an account executive of George Tresher Associates in the administration of Mayor Edward Koch when the agency was newly created. Mr. Gunther began his career as a special assistant to the commissioner at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs following a year of studying abroad in France. He has held voluntary positions at an array of historic, cultural, and civic organizations throughout New York City. And in 2020, he embarked with co-author Gay Giordano on a new book to be called Fooling the Contemporary Eye, Designing Illustration for Today, due from Rizzoli in the spring, it's coming up soon, of 2022. So again, we want to welcome Paul. Thank you so much for joining us. We are really looking forward to your conversation tonight with Elizabeth. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
Designing illusion. And,
illusion.
And since you got that, Rizzoli has shortened it to illusion in design.
Okay. There we go. So you get it firsthand.
Brevity counts. But anyway,
so Paul, you'll have to, once the book is out, you must come back again and we'll do something around the book.
Yeah, let me quickly set up why I think Elizabeth asked me, and then she can, and Nicola can. And first of all, there are two reasons, two principal reasons. One, we're right across the water system from you all, as you know. And can
I just say something, Paul? I would say a stunning view. You know, when you're standing on Randall's Island, you come down and you look across, it's just a stunning view. Crazy.
And so what we did, since I started in 2017, 1 year into the de Blasio administration. I was not there the first year. As some of you know, a quick background, it had been that residence since 42. Next year is the 80th anniversary of its service as the mayor's residence. The house dates 1799, but the official role was 42 when LaGuardia came in on his third term, paradoxically due to the war. It was what we would call national security. They called civil defense. That's what prompted it. In any case, Bloomberg, it went on that way with 9 mayors, and then Bloomberg disrupted that. He didn't live there. And he spent a lot of money. He was very generous to the house. He refurbished it for the second major refurbishment in its 20th century history. And but didn't live there. So de Blasio had to resume that role, and I missed that sort of rocky period of moving back in, which I believe will continue now for as long into the future as any of us can foresee. I don't see another Bloomberg who can literally afford not to live there, so to speak, by bringing his own security and by paying for his own security and all those other factors that allowed him to make that decision. So I sort of have changed up the art that's shown, and I've changed up the narration that we use. And part of that is the geography of the site. So whenever I can, I talk as much as I can about the site and the extraordinary importance of the site and why Hellgate is Hellgate and why it's so, even when it looks specific, it's very violent. And so the convergence of the Harlem and the Hudson, the East River, which, as all of you know, is a tidal strait, not really a river, and frankly, the Long Island Sound. So you've got everything coming there, all these extraordinary systems. And it's no wonder that it was such choice real estate for not only Gracie, but presumably well before that. When we know now the Dutch were there, and we can be pretty sure that it was significant in agriculture and certainly for fishing and hunting for the Lenape, the Wappinger Confederacy is, it's very complicated. So I've tried to bring that into focus. And so I talk about Triborough Bridge. I talk about Ward's and Randall's Island. I point out people where we are in the geography. I sometimes even say that if you keep going up a little bit along the East River, you'll come to Rikers Island, which is in the news. And so the site is very, very important to me. And I don't know if others have ever stressed it as much, but I do. And I think there's opportunity to do more of that with or without me in a future administration to sort of bridge the river and talk more about Randall's and all the different, of which plants and botany is one piece. We're all of the same geographic phenomenon, this extraordinary convergence in New York. One of the great, it is, as Elizabeth said, it's one of the great views in New York. And if you haven't been there, probably you have, but you'll come soon when we reopen. And again, we make an effort to go outside to the extent we can to make sure people understand that. It also now has the ferries coming and going right in front of Gracie. It's actually on the top deck, you can see virtually straight into the front porch of Gracie. So the other reason is that we have taken several plant-based initiatives, and very much in the spirit of braiding Sweetgrass. Not that I knew that at the time, but in a sense, I backed into so much inspiration and meaning from braiding Sweetgrass sort of ex post facto by thinking in a different way, and I guess in the sense thinking better of what we undertook. And there are two major pieces of that. One was I introduced these special shows. One was called Windows on the City, which was New York in 1799. That's the year Gracie built the house. Archibald Gracie built a country house along the East River. In the late 18th century, early 19th century, wealthy New Yorkers built country houses along the East River. Not the Hudson. The Hudson was, it didn't mean a thing until the Erie Canal, really. I mean, I'm overstating, but to make the point. And so the East River was like the Thames. It was like Gin Lane. It was like the Maidstone Club. It was like, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Wealthy people had houses along the river. John Jacob Astor was right next door. And they would come by boat, and it would have been a little bit like the coast of Maine. Again, you people are very sophisticated. You know much more about the topography of the area than the average New Yorker, so forgive me if I'm stating the obvious, but it would have been a rocky shore. They would have gone down tumbled down the hill to the rocky shore. They had a dock or some kind of mooring to bring sailboats up from the downtown, from the city where they lived. And they had a plantation, self-supporting farm, not a plantation, but orchards and pigs and whatever it would need to maintain the household. The second show, that was Windows on the City. So we looked at what was going on in New York in 1799 to the extent we could. Then we leapt to New York 1942, which was, again, at that time, the 75th anniversary of its use as the house, 1942 and 2017. Just quickly, the two subsequent were called She Persists, a century of women artists in New York City, 1919, 2019 for the 19th Amendment, and then most recently, Catalyst, Art and Social Justice. So backing up to 42, in 42, as part of that undertaking, we built a victory garden, or garden for victory. And we had a horticulturist then who was terrific. And she and I worked on the research, and we put in raised beds because the dirt there is so filthy with lead that besides the convenience and attractiveness of raised beds, the woman said, my colleague said, root vegetables or tubers, whatever they were, would be literally toxic because you had all these lead from, as you know, the front lawn of Gracie is the roof of the FDR Drive. When you go past Alpha Green, you're going under an underpass, you're effectively under Gracie. And then after that, you're under Carl Schurz Park. But initially, you're literally underneath Gracie. We have stacks coming up through the garden that are sort of disguised, which are the ventilation. So the fumes come straight onto Gracie's lawn. And in the old days, that meant lead. So we built these raised beds and we planted them in the very sophisticated way, following pretty as precisely as we could what they would have done, which was things like Swiss chard, rutabaga, very high yield, quick growing, 2 or 3 crops a year, if you were lucky, a season, intermingled with garlic, which kept the bugs away, and onions and all kinds of things. So that was fun. We had this victory garden and that persists. We're not as curatorially precise as we were that year, but it continues. And then as part of this last show, our Catalyst, Art and Social Justice, there was an artist, maybe you probably know who she is, Linda Goodbryan. She's an artist and she's a very important early gallerist. And that's the word we use. I don't like it, but I'm going to use it. In the 70s, she started just above Midtown, which was a Harlem gallery, which showcased or featured for the first time many African-American artists who were not shown elsewhere, many of whom are now extremely important artists like David Hammons. These are some of the evidence of work she did. And in fact, MoMA next fall is going to have the big show next fall is called Just Above, Linda Goodbryan and Just Above Midtown. It's going to feature work. Anyway, she was part of the roster of artists we invited to be included in this show. So she said, I'm going to propose a greenhouse. So let's call it a conceptual work of art because it's just a greenhouse, but nonetheless, it had her benediction, her impulse to be a resource for urban farming and better nutrition on the grounds of Gracie. And for that reason, it's not a pretty greenhouse. It's not a Victorian greenhouse or a crystalline greenhouse. We wanted to have a more functional aspect. And of course, that was good news for the budget besides. So I had no problem with that. The Gracie Conservancy is all private money raised, by the way. We don't use city money. I don't work for the city per se. I work for the taxpayers of New York, but as an agent of a not-for-profit. So she conceived this. The formal name of it is Food, Farm, Garden, Greenhouse, and Training for Moms and Children. I don't like the moms and children, but that's the official name. We tend to say parents. And she has done it with something called Project EATS, CAP EATS, Active Citizen Project, which is an ongoing initiative for, again, better urban nutrition, training, better cooking, better habits, etc. So
Paul, could I link this into, because you love the book. Yeah. There was that interesting article in the New York Times today about the new Indigenous cookbook that someone is working on that will have stories along with the food. And that actually reminded me, I was going to ask you if you'd read a little bit from the Three Sisters chapter in the book, but you invited me to Gracie Mansion when you were giving out those little packets of seeds. This was in October of 2019. I actually brought the seeds. So it was the squash, beans, and pumpkin, or whatever you had, corn in this. So I brought home this little brown envelope, put it on my basket on my desk. I think took it out during the pandemic. And Nikki, can you show the slides of my, so I, as I say, I think it was during the pandemic, I found this little brown envelope and I did a little reading. I put the seeds in damp paper towel and put them in a plastic bag and then put it in a warm place, and they sprouted. And I had these just wonderful little, it was like Jack and the Beanstalk. I woke up and it seemed like every day they would just grow a little bit more. I kept them on my windowsill, and I was going to, actually I had this idea as they got larger that maybe I'd take them out to Randall's Island and sort of surreptitiously plant them, but they never got there, poor things. So they outgrew their pots. But can you read, just so that can you read a little bit? You might tell us about those seeds, because you still are going to have those seeds at Gracie.
Yeah. So I'll just, so we have the greenhouse, and then also as part of this catalyst to art and social justice, and we had an artist named Tatfoo Tan, Tattfoo, but it's Tatfoo Tan, based in Staten Island, lives in Staten Island. He's an artist, and he has an ongoing project, which is SOS, Sustainable Organic Stewardship, Free Seeds Library. And he based it on the Little Free Library that has been around for a while, where people put books out by, in public squares and churches and what have you. And he decided he would just put these little colorful boxes up that had free seeds. And it's still ongoing, and they'll pop up here and there. And we have four of Tatfoo Tan's seed boxes. So you reach in, you're not supposed to look, you reach in and you grab seeds. So those are the two legacies. And lastly, before I start to read, and maybe quickly, Nicola, you could show my pictures real quick now. I'll do a quick, before I start the reading, I'll quickly show some of some of my wonderful docent colleagues are on this call, and I want to shout out to them. But the trouble with all this is it opened in February 20th of 2020. So we had 2 weeks of tours, two and a half weeks of public access before it all closed down. So can you throw those up, Nicola?
I'm trying, I'm sorry, it's frozen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, oh, okay. Well, anyway, no big deal. But anyway, so those are, but those two parts of this final installation we did are indeed legacies. And lastly, all of this is presumably very good news, because if in fact, in the unlikely event that Eric Adams is elected the next mayor, as some of you may know, he is a vegan. And in fact, urban nutrition and plant-based eating is a very, very central pillar of his civic view. And I believe he'll make it a big, be sort of, I thought it would be like literacy, sort of phone, besides everything else. I like literacy. I think you'll see then he's going to make a very big deal about it. So bingo, we're providing him with these tools in literally his front lawn in order to, I hope, do his work, advocate, teach, implement to the extent he can. But it's a very important part. Ezra Klein did a podcast about it. Next slide. If I'll give you a moment to. So there's the little greenhouse.
And we had, on our last session in September, Evan Pritchard spoke and showed his amazing, amazing maps. And he mentioned that, so they are up on your website, on the Gracie Mansion website, so that you're looking at kind of the history of the land and what's there and what's underneath and everything else.
Correct. The next slide. There you see how it's juxtaposed. on the lawn. The 18th century porch is in the background, but it's not that conspicuous. This picture obviously calls attention to it, but when you're on the front lawn in the totality of the landscape, it's not that significant in the overall scheme of things. Although it's not small, it's not tiny, and it's surrounded by raised beds. Next slide. There's the Tatfu's ongoing project, and those you reach in and grab the seeds, which grow very readily. That's what
I sure do.
So there are 4 of those sprinkled around the lawn, the grounds.
Be nice to have them around the city, wouldn't it, Paul?
Well, it would be, and he has tried, and he does them here and there, but I think they have a tough time maintaining them. But he's tried. Next one. I only have a few images, so don't worry. So overall, this food initiative, which was sort of born, but in some ways still born because we haven't had the public, which without the public, the alchemy, the whole purpose of it has been thwarted or stalled, if you will. But all that can go forward in 2022. And I think that's the last image. Just quickly check. Yeah, just great. Okay, thank you, Nicholas. So that's, I think, between the geographic location as part of the sort of watershed that Randall's is such an important part of, the plant-based initiatives, and the fact that we'd have, as Elizabeth alluded, on the website, something called the Horns Hook Project, delved into the pre-colonial and pre-English colonial and pre-early American Republican roots of the site, to look at the Dutch and perhaps more importantly, the 10,000 years of First Nation occupation.
Yeah, it's interesting that I've just been reading about a new museum in Oklahoma City, which is one of the largest Native American museums in the country, just opened. And apparently it's the largest single building tribal cultural center that's honoring Oklahoma's 39 tribal nations, but also housing the National Native American Hall of Fame. So, and apparently the architecture incorporates circles and spiral shapes, which play much into the spirituality and the ceremonies of Native Americans. I can't wait to visit. And I thought it would be lovely if we could have someone from the museum perhaps join one of our November or December conversation.
Great idea.
Yeah, and it's nice, Paul, that we're doing this right at the week of Indigenous Peoples Day. And I did a little research. I learned that South Dakota was the first state to actually have a day designated as an Indigenous People Day in 1990. And then that was followed by Vermont, Oregon, and Alaska. And there were 3 cities who've been kind of in the forefront of this: Berkeley, California, Seattle, Washington, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. But it just seems, one of the ways that we're looking at braiding sweetgrass, not in a traditional way, the way you would traditionally read a book, but as a book group per se, but is to use it as a lens to think about culture and history and geography of Native Americans, because it's been left out. I've been just fascinated just in the research that I've done to start to put some of these programs together about how much I've learned and how much it's just at the beginning. And that's what Robin Kilmer does in her book. So, I always ask people to read a little bit. So can you read?
So I'm going to. So part of what we've done in the raised beds and in the greenhouse, and we'll do more of, are the 3 sisters, and which are often known to me, who am somewhat of an amateur. I'm a sort of professional autodidact, because I have to be at Gracie. I have to learn a lot of things to keep the narrative going and shake things up, which is what this mayor and first lady wanted. They wanted, a much broader look at Gracie, look at the city, which Gracie affords, as long as you dig a little deeply. So I knew them as La Tres Sorellas, the three sisters, and they're very often called Las Tres Sorellas. And I know that Michael Pollan talked about them and how, you know, the Mexicans, the corn is, you know, a genetically manipulated product. Nobody really understands how it happened. It's sort of this miracle of human history that somehow nobody really understands how it was domesticated, but there you go. So we have in the greenhouse and in the seed packets, we have corn, indigenous corn, red corn. We have squash.
That's what I was.
It was called Tours, like the French city. I didn't know there was such a squash, but it turns out there's a squash called Tours, Tours, and then beans. We have other crops, other seeds too, but those are the principal ones. So we have planted these together. So I was delighted beyond measure when I read this book and saw that indeed she makes such a, and there's a whole chapter and she alludes to it a number of times, but for me, that was perhaps the highlight of so many fine chapters. And I thought it starts, one of those sentences she uses early on in that chapter called The Three Sisters is, plants speak in a tongue that every breathing thing can understand. Plants teach in a universal language, food. And so, yes, we have a pretty garden. Yes, we have lots and lots of tulips put out in the spring, which of course ties back to New Amsterdam, although they're really from Turkey, I discovered. But anyway, we have all that. The Dutch brought them from Turkey. But it's been much more meaningful to have food. And in the pandemic, to some extent, the gardens and greenhouse have actually sustained the household, which I know you could say, oh, la-di-da, who cares what the mayor eats? And fair enough, but it's nonetheless a metaphor, it's a model, which as soon as we can go more public, I think will be, you know, it's not just an indulgence. It's not just, oh, look, they can eat well, healthfully. We can use it to teach, which is the whole point. But I would like to read on page 132, a paragraph, if I might, about the three. And as you understand, the corn comes up first, very early, grows very, very quickly. It's the shaft, right? And it is providing energy, sugar. It's followed by the bean, which uses the quick growing stalk to grow on. And besides enriching the soil, it's a source of protein. It's not as productive as the corn, but it has a very high protein yield. And then the squash, which is slow growing, despite Elizabeth's experience in general, it's relatively slow growing, that comes in and fills in between, which helps keep the weeds down as the summer progresses. But you have this wonderful mound, if you will, of three three joyfully coexisting crops, who then, which also have a broad nutrition value, and then because of the beans in large measure, in fact, enrich the soil. The nitrogen enriches the soil for the next year. So Robin writes much more beautifully than I say, you can tell they are sisters. One twines easily around the other in relaxed embrace, while the sweet baby sister lolls at their feet, close but not too close, cooperating, not competing. Seems to me I've seen this before in human families, in the interplay of sisters. After all, there are three girls in my family. The firstborn girl knows that she is clearly in charge. Tall and direct, upright and efficient, she creates the template for everyone else to follow. Ta-da, the corn stalk. That's the corn sister. There's not room for more than one corn woman in the same house, so the middle sister is likely to adapt in different ways. This bean girl learns to be flexible, adaptable, and find a way around the dominant structure to get the light that she needs. The sweet baby sister is free to choose a different path, as expectations have already been fulfilled. Well-grounded, she has nothing to prove and finds her way, a way that contributes to the good of the whole. So that is indeed the vitamins at the slower growing, slower yielding squash. We also have a lot of melons. So I don't know that it's official, but at Gracie, the squash withers out, but the melons vines are still going strong. We still have watermelon and honeydew coming off the garden. And then if I could read some more, I don't know if I have time to read some more in that chapter. There are two other places. There are layers upon layers of reciprocity in this garden, in the three sisters, between the bean and the bacterium, the bean and the corn and the squash, and ultimately with the people, i.e. consumption, right? Food. The way of the three sisters reminds me of one of the basic teachings of our people. The most important thing each of us can know is our unique gift and how to use it in the world. Individuality is cherished and nurtured because in order for the whole to flourish, each of us has to be strong in who we are and carry our gifts with conviction so that it can be shared with others. Being among the sisters provides a visible manifestation of what a community can become when its members understand and share their gifts. In reciprocity, we fill our spirits as well as our bellies. So I loved that part of the book where she's so direct about the crops and the lessons we can learn from indigenous planting.
You know, Paul, I was there was an op-ed in the October 3rd Sunday Review, New York Times, and the title was "Let the Streams Run Free," and I just want to read a paragraph from it. The Lenape people who once inhabited the hills and valleys that we now call New York City knew better than to dig caves in stream beds. They noticed how salt marshes and barrier beaches work together to protect that coastline and restore it after storms. They saw that soil absorbs water and rocks repel it. And Robin writes so poetically. I mean, that's why this book has been such an amazing success. But if we had only listened to the people who had found this land, I mean, we might not be in quite the climate mess that we're in at the moment, because they had figured out how so much of this worked and, what worked together. In let's use the word kind of entangled together.
Right, absolutely. No, and so much of the book is about indigenous plant. Part of the book. I spend weekends. I spend time out on the northern fork of Long Island, Orient, the tip of the North Fork, which as you may know, ends with a ferry to New London. And it sort of tilts up. You can see unlike a lot of Long Island, you can see the coast of Connecticut. And so right across from us is Lyme, Connecticut. People say, do you have Lyme disease? I point to the horizon and say, that's Lyme. So question answered. We also have an enormous amount of invasive stuff. I mean, it's so horrible. I mean, and I've been there for 12 years. I just rent seasonally, but I have seen the landscape change so drastically. The forest floor disappear, any kind of native wildflower disappear, being displaced by prickly invasive things. And so there was part of me reading this book that felt despair, because even since she's written it, I think things have gotten worse, at least in parts of the country. And to create the kind of forage paradise and the beautiful landscapes that she describes, you'd have to spend, $200 million to create a garden that resembled what was there 20 years ago. It's very depressing to me. I mean, and she does talk about that, and pull out the garlic mustard, pull out the Phragmites, but at least there it's a lost cause. So I don't know. I guess my point is, the sooner this message is heard, the better, because time and change is unfolding very destructively, very rapidly. And I thought, when I read this book and Elizabeth's kind invitation, I thought, could we try to introduce native plants? I know there were plum trees. You guys on Randall's, you probably know that that area was known for its plums. It's, I guess, beach plums, would naturally are long gone. And I thought, well, maybe we should try to introduce some native plants and native forage plants and what have you. So I don't know whether I will survive in another administration, which is, who cares? So it's not important. But I will, if I stay, or if I'm able to at least do an exit memo, I'm going to say maybe create a tiny little bed of quote unquote native, of plants, or native, especially edible native plants, so that we can add that to our plant-based library of resources for our visitors.
Don't you think that the book, Paul, has really pushed all of us to think? I mean, there's so much going on Randall's Island. I mean, we've gone through a lot of this, and we'll do more of it through our programs, reading Vesper Flights and World of Wonders, and we've had a farm program. And I mean, Randall's Island was really dedicated to this as well. And I think that at least now that we're beginning to understand some of this, I had a conversation last week with Simon Mundy, who's a journalist for the Financial Times. I worked with him on a project in Korea several years ago, and he has just published a book. It's available in the UK. It's published by HarperCollins. It will be available in the United States in mid-January, called Race for Tomorrow. And he said, as his desire as a journalist was to understand climate change, which he thought was the biggest story of the century. So he took 2 years off, and he traveled to 26 countries, 6 continents. And, he went to the glacier in the Himalayas, and he went to Africa. And what he's trying to look at is, what has happened, but not only is to look at some of the new projects that are being built to try to stem some of the problems. And yet, in some ways, they're creating more problems. And so again, I think a book like Braiding Sweetgrass, we get back to the gardens and, the natural, and this sort of, when you really know the land, the Thanksgiving, you were going to read something, Paul, from the Thanksgiving prayer too.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the Thanksgiving address, which if you've read the book or reading the book, there's this chapter called Allegiance to Gratitude. She refers to the Thanksgiving address repeatedly, and has a chapter where she sort of, and so there's, to keep up this theme, I thought, it's the chapter Allegiance to Gratitude. And she has one section.
Maybe you can read a little, Paul.
I want to read just this one section to keep up this theme of the Three Sisters, because the Three Sisters is, in fact, was so universal in the native First Nation cultures that it's spread throughout, especially including the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. Forgive my pronunciation of that. And it's discursive, right? She'll quote it and then she'll comment. So I wonder if there are kids here who, like my daughter, rebel, who refuse to stand and say thank you to the earth. It seems hard to argue with gratitude for berries. Then she switches to the Thanksgiving address. With one mind, we honor and thank all the food plants we harvest from the garden, especially the Three Sisters who feed the people with such abundance. Since the beginning of time, the grains, vegetables, beans, and fruit have helped the people survive. Many other living things draw strength from them as well. We gather together in our minds all the plant foods and send them a greeting and thanks. Now our minds are one. Then she just discursively says the kids take note of each addition and nod in agreement, especially for food. And then she talks about medicine and the relationship with other animals, et cetera. But that, again, just to maintain that central idea, which I hope animates what we do at Gracie Ahead, which is that we're food. It's food. It's an indigenous garden. It's trying to respect and understand the past, but it's also to feed city dwellers in a better way that's more aligned. It happens to be aligned with indigenous culture, which is sort of a cherry on the whipped cream. And I think it was valuable in any case, but now we can add this further significance thanks to things like this wonderful book.
Are there any other parts that you'd like to read?
Well, I'd love to answer any questions or comments. That's always the most helpful and rewarding for me. And sometimes I learn about Gracie and maybe I can read some more about it.
There's also, I know there've been some questions in the chat, or some comments in the chat about Randall's Island, and Chris has had something. I mean, maybe we can raise those. Nikki, do you want to?
Well, I'd like to know, have there been, you've done some native plantings, I take it?
Yes, so Chris commented on that. I don't know, Chris, if you want to jump in or you just want me to read this, but that we, during the restoration process a number of years ago near the Hellgate salt marsh in the upland areas, some of the plums have been replanted there, as well as on the Bronx shoreline near the Triborough Bridge. And
great.
Also Chris noted that they come from New York City Parks Nursery in Van Cortlandt, which is a wonderful resource. So, and that's been over the last few years. So
yeah, and Paul, just to say, you're absolutely right. I actually only learned through Evan's research that we were known for our plums, as was Roosevelt Island for these beach plums. And I'll fully admit, when we first introduced them back into the landscape, centuries after they had been lost due to development of the island, that I hadn't known that about the history of them and the anthropological history of them. But it makes me feel even better to know that we've been introducing them, not only because they were something that would have historically been there given our ecology, but that they were also valued, noted, and appreciated as a result of our human ecology.
Right. No, I'm thrilled to hear that you've reintroduced them, and I'm ashamed I didn't know that. And of course, we can't do that at Gracie because the coast, the coastline, the shoreline, whatever you want to say, is so severed. I mean, that'll never. When that comes back, none of us will be around. None of New York City won't be around. But anyway, so it's nice to know they're across the Hellgate.
Well, and Chris, you just had Indigenous Peoples Day on Randall's Island. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best weather this weekend, but that's become an annual event as well.
That's true. We were host of the what has now been the annual Indigenous Peoples celebration on Randall's Island, and I encourage you all to look more into that and the Red Hawk Council that's there. I do have to say, though, that back to you, Paul, I think that, the Gracie Mansion and areas surrounding, there's such this beautiful history of what we've done to the city, which might not necessarily be perceived as beautiful, but the work that whole area has done, Carl Schroes Park and Gracie Mansion, to try and bring back some of that ecology, I think is really beautiful and truly admirable. And as your neighbors, it's very much appreciated. And as somebody who uses the FDR, who bikes up along the pathway there, it's really great. I think one of the most compelling things to me about that whole vertical shoreline is there's this one little pocket of green that's mostly sort of seeds that have found their way there. It's about 2 stories up above the water. There's no way a person could safely necessarily access it. But I think it speaks to sort of the tenacity of our environment. And I always find it as this sort of beautiful reflection on how we've shaped the landscape, how the landscape might have once been, and where the landscape could soon go.
Right. No, there's nothing more joyful than volunteers.
all the museums. I mean, the Cooper Hewitt and MoMA. I mean, all of them. When you look at there's a whole series of programs this fall at Cooper Union on sort of ecological infrastructure, and I mean, so many people hopefully are looking at this now to see what we can do now that we've done such a great job at overbuilding and overdeveloping and everything else.
I'm so happy about the plums. Are there other?
There was one a comment from Jane. It said the gratitude section is really nice near the end of tending seagrass section, shortly before the three sisters in the picking seagrass section. You pointed that out.
Yeah, I mean, I did. Yes, and I did. There was another chapter. Elizabeth and I were talking earlier. And on page, this is not exactly that, but in the chapter, sorry, I'm going to find it. Sorry. There's a chapter that is about the graduate student, the PhD student that she assists, and when she's setting out to try to understand sweetgrass and restore sweetgrass and find sweetgrass, and which after all is this central theme of the book. And so if I can read that, I mean, again, it's not exactly what you're referring to, but she's talking about herself here. This is when she becomes more autobiographical, which is part of the charm of the book. As an enthusiastic young PhD, colonized by the arrogance of science, I had been fooling myself that I was the only teacher. The land is the real teacher. All we need as students is mindfulness. Paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world, receiving the gifts with open eyes and open heart. My job was just to lead them into the presence and ready them to hear. On that smoky afternoon, the mountains taught the students and the students taught the teacher. And again, she then refers in another chapter about how the PhD student that's working with Sweetgrass has that same epiphany, has that same awareness, and reminds the author of that essential lesson, which is, and it's funny because if you read the book, she starts out, she's sort of brings herself willfully into the arrogance of science. And she sort of departs from an innate sense of plants, learns the arrogance of science, and then revisits and blends back in the roots that she came from in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's why it's such an interesting book, because we're looking at it through, the lens of a scientist and a mother and a poet. I love the in the Maple Nation chapter, A Citizenship Guide, she writes, if I were forced, I would choose Maple Nation. If citizenship is a matter of shared beliefs, then I believe in the democracy of species. If citizenship means an oath of loyalty to a leader, then I choose the leader of the trees. If good citizens agree to uphold the laws of the nation, then I choose natural law, the law of reciprocity, of regeneration, of mutual flourishing.
Absolutely.
I mean, I do have one friend who's an artist who felt that it was, the difficulty in reading the book was that we won't be able to achieve all that she outlines, that, that it just will be impossible, and, that it was almost frustrating in trying to think about that. But I think you have to always be pushed, to the far end to kind of come back to the middle. And certainly, I mean, what you're doing at Gracie and what will be, as you indicate, it seems like then Eric Adams will, or the next mayor will continue, want this.
And how, more than we have.
Yeah, it will be interesting. Yeah, what's the title of his new book that you said was coming out?
It's called, and the pub date was yesterday. I haven't ordered on Amazon, which I try not to do, but I did. So I thought I'd get it today, but it's called Healthy at Last, a plant-based approach to preventing and reversing diabetes and other chronic illnesses. And it's a combination of memoir and recipes. So it's a little bit like Nora Ephron and others who have done that. And it's recipes from a lot of guests, other well-known vegans, and others who have had the same life-changing epiphany experience. And it's interesting because, he's at that moment when politicians, I think all of you, politicians do their, Obama did the one about his father, they do their biography, they do their dream of how the world should work. And I love the fact that he's sort of taking that golden opportunity that politicians have in writing about veganism. I mean, I think that's there's something wonderful that he's using that point of maximum attention and goodwill to write about that, of all things. Not
well, it's always
well,
we know that when children learn about how food is grown, they see carrots come out, they're more interested in eating them rather than fast foods if they know something about it, if they're engaged in the process. And I know that there've been a lot of programs of gardening in inner cities to try to help people, with healthy living, to engage them. And I mean, that's Randall's Island. I mean, the urban farm. That's the whole idea, is to bring people, people who might not have an opportunity to get out of the city, to have the experience of growing and the urban farm experience.
If there's a podcast, if you want to listen, and Ezra Klein about 3 weeks ago, if you can find it easily, Ezra Klein has a podcast with Eric Adams, candidate Adams, and he pretty much talks only about veganism. It's, I think, quite interesting, but also he talks about it in cultural and historic terms, which I found riveting. And he talks about how you take things like collard and with traditional African-American cuisine, or what we think of it as traditional or common. And he makes the obvious point that it's extremely healthy. Those are two of the healthiest things that are around. Kale, right? Kale is the cure of everything. But in the slave culture, and when they had a fight to survive, that the fat, I mean, I'm just quoting him, I don't know, the fat that came off the farm, the fat left over, the fat that was not used, so the pig's feet, the hocks, the whatever it might be, were this wonderful source of nutrition that they went for. We can add dietary benefit by putting these pork hocks in with the collard greens. But it was survival. It was intuitive. It was, how can we maximize what's available to us as food, and how that has now become, in part of the recipe, so to speak, and how he, I think, can help reverse that. That's his plan. So I think he can. But it's to remind you that by putting, again, I'm not putting words in his mouth, but by putting pig's feet in your collards, it's actually oppressive to do that. You're robbing yourself of the nutrition that young, liberal, elite white people are eating, by going to the urban markets and whatever. So it's thrilling. It's exciting to actually look at it through that lens, of that historic lens of, do you understand why some of that is, and why that was a necessity that is no longer a necessity. In fact, the opposite.
I think this the book that was in the Time, the Indigenous book that was mentioned in the Times today, is called A Gathering Basket. Mm-hmm. And there's already a website that you can look at, but it's time to end. And I wanted to read one paragraph from the Collateral Damage chapter. She's talking about walking in a beautiful night. It has been said that people of the modern world suffer a great sadness, a species loneliness, estrangement from the rest of creation. We have built this isolation with our fear, with our arrogance, and with our homes brightly lit against the night. For a moment, as we walked this road, those barriers dissolved, and we began to relieve the loneliness and know know each other once again. So I thought was very beautiful. So Paul, tell us, I know we have people who might want to visit Gracie Mansion. When will they be able to visit and pick up some seeds from the seed box?
Well, good question. There will be this is probably not that interesting to this audience, but they are restoring that famous Halloween event, which was always a big deal, on the 30th and 31st of October, but it's going to be all outside. So at the very least, you could see the greenhouse and the seed boxes and the raised beds. The trouble is you'll also see lots and lots of garish decorations. And so frankly, I don't recommend that you come. But I think in January, that's my hope. When that sort of next wave of reopening, and you have a new resident, presumably Adams, who will presumably want to welcome people in as fast as he can. And so we'll see.
But Paul, that you and your docents are always welcome on Randall's Island.
Yeah, I'm gonna come see the plums.
We want to give you a tour, so we'd love to have you come over. And have you visited the urban garden?
No.
Well, then you must come. So we'll work out a time when you can come over to see, and as I say, bring your gardeners and the people who are doing the garden at your greenhouse over to Randall's Island and see what they're doing.
My just quickly, you guys. My big history with Randall's Island is the following. I was at the Municipal Art Society in the sort of, Jackie Onassis, Brendan Gill, Saved Grand Central, blah, blah, blah. So let's call it the Golden Age. Indulge me, call it the Golden Age. And so we started this thing called Adopt a Monument, which is still ongoing. And it was a slow news day at the time. So we did this story, and lo and behold, we ended up on A1 above the fold. Back when A1 above the fold out at 11 o'clock, and remember you'd leave the theater and go get the newspaper at 11 o'clock, and wow, and there was this. So it became this world news, and it went like crazy. And so one of the first ones we adopted was called Discus Thrower, and Discus Thrower had been on Randall's, and it was in storage, falling apart. So I went out there. We adopted that, and I went out for, I think it was Koch. Can't remember who it would have been. Probably Koch or Dinkins for the re-unveiling of Discus Thrower, which I hope is still in good shape. I'm sure it is, but it was in some lousy, horrible storage. I think on the island actually. But anyway, that was my one tiny contribution to Randall's Island.
Well, there's a lot to see, and the bike trails, and you can launch your kayak, and there's a lot. So I hope, Paul, that you come and visit us.
I will. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.